So we're talking about Stephen King on screen today, a new documentary about the horror author. So, look who it is. Welcome back, Matt, from Microfilm, who have a new album.
We do. It's out now. It's called Body Arcana. It's out everywhere, so streaming everywhere, digital music stores everywhere. It's a dance record. We haven't done a dance album in a couple years. 10 tracks, beats on every one of them. We kind of want to go, we made something cerebral and kind of ethereal last time. We wanted to make something a lot more user-friendly and danceable and approachable this time. So it's out there.
And it's amazing. I've heard it. Do you want to give us a twirl as well, Anthea? Everyone in the UK will get that phrase.
Well, there's these t-shirts for sale with our
Oh, hang on. Let me
put
you on a full screen. There we go.
Quite amazing.
I love how there's no I in there. I think it's quite modern.
Yeah. My partner in the band, he reversed the M, so the M, the serif, is that the term? The serif of the M becomes the I.
Nothing is obvious to me. So Stephen King on screen then, a documentary. I mean, obviously we've covered horror before. By the way, we are Boys on Film. If you are new here, please do subscribe if you like reviews of movies and TV shows. We do a lot. Matt very kindly does a lot of reviews with us. We are based in the UK, in London, but Matt, you're in Portland.
Yeah, Portland, Oregon.
So then the documentary, feature documentary, it's the ultimate guide to your king of nightmares, or the king of nightmares. That's what it says in the press release. Obviously one of the best-selling authors. Are you a fan of his books? Do you read his books? I know that you've seen a lot of his adaptations, film adaptations.
I have, but I think this is a case with maybe people our age or relatively our age, is that I read them more as a kid or as a teenager, and I haven't read any of his newer stuff in a long time. I've seen newer films of his, but not I haven't read anything in decades of his personally.
No, I'm the same. I think probably the last book that I read of his was Carrie, because I love the film, and they talk about that in the documentary as well, that a lot of people did migrate over to the books because they'd seen the films and loved the films, and I think there's obviously a lot of fans of his books anyway before they've seen the films, and obviously there's a lot more detail in some of his books, like Misery. A lot of the detail is different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's I think they talk about it in the doc, where when you're doing a screenplay of a novel, sometimes you can be relatively faithful and sometimes they just take the core of the story or the outline and kind of alter it to make it a little bit more visual. I mean, there's a huge chunk of the stock is about The Shining and how Stanley Kubrick kind of took the bare bones of the story, but then added his own details, added his own scenes and scenarios, and it kind of changed it to the point where Stephen King really disliked the film a lot, because not because it's a poorly made film, but because it's not the story that he wrote.
It's not a very personal story, or it doesn't kind of put across the humanity, does it, like his books do? Because his books are quite, they're focused on people and the strength of people, the power of people. Like Carrie, obviously, about a girl being bullied, and it's kind of like about the relationship of between her and her mother and the religion that plays a part of that. So I think his humanity does come across in his books, whereas some of the film adaptations may be less so, particularly The Shining that you mentioned. I think that's why he had beef with it.
Yeah, but that's also a problem with making films in general from a book, is that it might not 100% be what the book is, but it might even be better than the book if the filmmaker's that good, or it might elevate what was good into great. And I personally think that he does that, or that Stanley Kubrick did that with The Shining, that the book was it was good, but the movie added so much more depth to it and made it more of a serious kind of family drama, as well as horror, as well as kind of existential dread film. Whereas when Stephen King did a remake of The Shining with a director, it was a TV movie in the US, maybe it was in theaters in the UK, it was more faithful to the book story, but it wasn't very good. It was really cheap looking and kind of cheesy. And Kubrick doesn't make cheesy, cheap films. He makes very lush, grand, huge films, and I think that taking a Stephen King story and adding those huge grand elements kind of elevates everything into a really classic piece of film.
They seem to dwell on The Shining quite a lot in this documentary. Some of the films, obviously it wasn't necessarily about the films as such, it was about him as a writer, about Stephen King as a writer. I mean, he didn't actually show up in the documentary until probably about halfway through it properly, where you see more of him as a person. You just hear about him, obviously, in the first half. But yeah, a lot of the films I thought were overlooked. Carrie, I think, was really overlooked, and I think that's one of his best film adaptations from his novel.
They brushed on it a little bit, but not too much. And that was one of the problems I had with the film. It started off chronological, and then it kind of just went every direction and jumped ahead to the 90s, and then jumped back to the 80s, and then jumped ahead to something current. And it kind of mixed it up. I wish there was something linear about the journey of this writer on film, where he has these really prestige, really well-received, great films. And then he has a period where there was a lot of crappy films from his books, or films that were totally overlooked. And then he kind of comes back to being respected again, and then he kind of disappears again. And I wish there was more of that journey, because I think that's really interesting how, as an author over decades, he kind of zooms in from being relevant and being part of a successful, really cool film to then being some obscure, like, there'll be like indie, obscure, tiny films made of his books that you might not even heard of. So it's kind of like, it's such a weird journey for this guy who's one of the most famous and successful authors of all time. And I wish they kind of showed the up and down journey a little bit more. And if they would have actually, because I don't think they interviewed him. I think it was clips of interviews of him, but they didn't.
And him showing up on film sets and stuff, like the Green Mile, when he was, I think he just had an accident. He hadn't been out for a while, and then he turned up at the premiere, and you see him obviously behind the scenes, and it's his birthday, and they give him a big cake. So there's lots of really juicy stuff, lots of really interesting stuff, and quite funny as well, because he's got a great sense of humour. But you're right, I mean, I felt the same. I felt like a lot was overlooked and kind of, like you say, wasn't really chronological, and I think that would have made it more interesting. But then again, I thought about that, and I thought, well, maybe it's because it's not necessarily about his film adaptations, it's more about him and how, you know, people that are influenced by him and people that have gone on to make films themselves, like we had Mike Flanagan, the other director, who said he's very inspired by his work. So it's kind of, I guess, more about his influence rather than about his timeline of films necessarily. But that did bug me a little bit, I have to say.
Yeah, and I think there was stress. I think it was probably due to who they could get on camera to do an interview. But it was a stress on certain films that it didn't really care about. Like, they talked about The Green Mile for 20 minutes of this doc, and I was just like, I don't care about that film. I think it's kind of schlocky.
I was going to ask you about this, because I really like the fact that they didn't just dwell on horror. Even though he's obviously a very famous and successful horror author, as well as the other stuff that he's written, which isn't horror, I quite like the fact that it was mixed up. I think if it had been just about his horror adaptations, it probably would have been a bit more interesting to me personally. But I like some of those films, though. I love The Green Mile, I love The Shawshank Redemption. So I was kind of interested to see about, how those films were influencing others. So it was quite interesting. But I think, maybe it's not, I don't know, advertised as a horror documentary necessarily. It might sway people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you had a scale and you were comparing how many were horror versus not horror, it probably was more horror, because most of his films are horror movies, not all of them. But most of them, but they did touch on, like you said, Shawshank Redemption a lot. The Green Mile, Stand By Me was another one they talked about a bit, which is a great film.
I love the fact the documentary also touched on how he understands women, or seems to understand women, because obviously the book Dolores Claiborne obviously made into the film, which I love that film. Kathy Bates is just movie. Amazing. Yeah, I like the fact that this documentary did touch on him, understanding people generally. I think was quite nice, and not just the cliche horror emphasis.
I'm wondering how much of an influence his wife is on his writing, because I know that was from the beginning. She must be a sounding board for his ideas, and maybe she helps him flesh out female characters more than he could himself, obviously, because she's a woman, and she's going to give him insight into what a woman would do or think about a situation versus what he would think as a man pretending to be a woman in writing.
I just think he's a really decent person, though. You see him really, defending the LGBT community as well, and he seems to really stick up for human rights. So I think he's that kind of person. People might think, because he's a horror writer, he's a bit of a dark character, but I think actually he understands people really well, and he seems to be quite a decent guy.
Yeah, I read. I don't follow him on Twitter, but I read a lot of tweets through retweets from someone else where he's kind of sticking up for the right side of history and not crazy conservative nightmare people.
He seems to have a good sense of humor as well.
Oh yeah, he's really funny, and he's really sarcastic and sharp, and kind of not afraid to kind of stick it to someone if they deserve it.
Yeah,
and I think you can see that in his acting or in his interviews, how he's witty but wry. Is that a word? W-R-Y, wry.
Yeah, he seems to have a dark sense of humour, and his characters that I completely forget that he does play parts in movies as well. I mean, obviously some of them are quite small roles, but like cameo roles. But yeah, I forget that he's an actor too.
Yeah, I looked on his Wikipedia filmography, and he's done dozens of roles throughout the last 40 plus years.
Yeah.
Probably really bit things, like you said. Except for Creepshow, he was a lead actor in one of the segments of that movie. But yeah, I think he's like pretty decent for what he's doing, and for a non-actor, he's not terrible.
So the verdict then, I don't think it's the most groundbreaking documentary out there, but I did enjoy it. I think it was produced in a good way. There was some interesting people, some great talking heads, people that really understood not just the genres.
One thing I wished is that a big Stephen King fan, would do an even greater kind of deep dive into his films, and do something like I don't know who the directors are, but the people who did the documentaries one was about Friday the 13th series, and one was about Nightmare on Elm Street series, where they're really long, like 4-hour long docs, where they cover every single film. I would love to have in every single film, even if some films get 5 minutes, in every single film kind of deep dive into his filmography, because he has dozens and dozens and dozens of films made from his books, like endless amount of films. So you could just like die. I mean, some of them are probably not worth talking about very much, but some of them that got overlooked this time are really pretty great, and they didn't really get a mention.
Yeah, so that's true. I think that would be fantastic, because you are seeing, like you say, a lot of those type of documentaries at the moment, and it seems to be quite a common thing. I wonder if it's going to be interesting to people that aren't necessarily familiar with Stephen King as a writer, or the films, or fans of horror. I don't know whether people would be interested. I guess if it was shorter, maybe, but I think people that are into him and horror and his books, whether they're horror or not, I think will be quite interested in this, or elements of it.
Of the doc we just watched, or a longer version? Yeah, because I mean, he's everyone knows who he is, whether or not you've actually read one of his books. Everyone knows who Stephen King is. Most people have probably seen it, like at least one of his films. Do you know what I mean? And probably liked it if it was one of the good ones.
I mean, how many people haven't seen Misery? I mean, most people have seen Misery, whether they're horror fans or not. Everybody will be talking about that ankle scene. Everybody knows it.
Yeah, oh yeah. Or Carrie, or The Shining, like the big ones. Or even if you haven't seen it, like Cujo, which is, most people have at least heard of it. Everyone knows what Cujo, when someone says that term, I think they talk about this in the doc.
Yeah.
When someone says that term, everyone knows what that means. It's like a dog that's like a killer dog.
Yeah, people have called, like, vicious dogs Cujos, haven't they, in day-to-day conversation? Exactly. It's almost like it's become a buzzword.
Or Children of the Corn. I think people kind of have used that terminology, one or another, about some kind of like scary small town or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, like I say, not the most groundbreaking documentary, but it was a good watch. I'm going to go for 3 stars.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'll give it 3 as well.
So it's out on, well, it's out now actually on digital platforms. You can stream it, but it's coming out a physical copy if you want one of those on Blu-ray and DVD on the 18th of September. It is called Stephen King on Screen. And that's what we thought of it. Matt, good to see you as always.
You too.
Good luck with the album. We'll put a link down below where people can purchase. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.